Welcome to the Athlete Insights Podcast, hosted by Yash Padday, a podcast focused on letting athletes tell their journeys in their sport. This podcast is presented by Boxed Water. Boxed water is better.
Welcome into another episode of the Athlete Insights Podcast. Today I've got my guest, Dr. Allison Smith. She's an assistant professor at Georgia State University. So, Dr. Smith, appreciate you. I know you said off camera you've been kind of balancing work calls and this. So I appreciate you making time and and chatting with me today.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah. So, as I do with all my guests, I want to kind of take it back to, because we are with sport and we're all sport management folks. I want to talk about kind of when did you first kind of I can't say like fall in love in a way with sport. What age did you really kind of get into sport?
Yeah, so I played my first T-ball game at the age of 5.
Okay.
And I think my mom made a joke when I was a kid that I spent more time playing in the dirt at the games than playing the actual sport itself. But I loved as a kid just being outside, being on the field. And my dad was a really big, avid athlete. He played
Mhm.
3 sports in high school. He was an incredible athlete my entire life. And
Sure.
so I was the oldest child. I think as a little kid, I grew up wanting to be just like him.
Uh-huh.
I remember from the age of 5 being in love with sports, and I played all different types of sports
Yeah.
throughout middle, high school, and then obviously went and played in college as well.
Gotcha. Can you talk about speaking of your high school career? We'll get to college here in a second. But speaking of your high school career, can you talk about your high school experience playing sport and what that was like?
Yeah, my high school experience was kind of unique. I played 3 sports going into my freshman year of high school. I had about a 8-inch growth spurt as a freshman. So I was a tiny little person coming into my freshman year and then grew to be 5'9", the height I am now as a freshman.
Gotcha.
So played volleyball and softball primarily at that point, kind of gave up basketball around that age.
Okay.
And saw a pretty fruitful career for myself playing volleyball, actually more than softball.
Uh-huh.
But I tore my ACL my junior year in a volleyball game and kind of had a big conversation with my father where I was just like, which sport do you think you really want to play in college? Like, which one do you
Mhm.
think is more, do you have a better chance of playing in? And as much as I thought I was a really good volleyball player, and I was,
Yeah.
uh, I was 5'9", and I don't know if anyone's watched on your podcast volleyball here recently in the
Uh-huh.
NCAAs, but most of those women are 6'2", 6'4", six
Yeah.
five.
Yeah.
So I went down the softball route, and I kind of spent my entire junior year rehabbing so that I could get recruited to play softball in college, which I did.
Gotcha. And speaking of recruiting, I'm always curious when I have athletes on about their recruiting process, and I know we'll get into because I want to talk about your PhD journey and your journey as a professor as well. But your recruiting process, can you kind of walk me through that about kind of how you went about that?
Yeah, so this was back before we made a lot of changes to the recruiting landscape and when
Yeah.
you can recruit and how you can recruit. But essentially, like similar to softball players now, around my junior years when they can start really talking to you, when they can start really recruiting you. And this is when I was coming off an ACL injury. So pretty early on into my junior and most of the start of my senior year, I didn't have a lot of interest. Like I
Mhm.
had some people that come and watch me pitch and were impressed by watching me pitch, but I'm wearing this massive brace on my knee the entire time. And so
Yeah.
they're kind of like, I don't know about this lady. You know,
Mhm.
she's
Yeah.
she's got an injury. And it just took honestly playing in a couple of tournaments through my senior year fall before I got recruited. And then I signed with a Division 1 school out of Manhattan, New York. I went to Manhattan College. Um, Went really far from home. Thought I was just big and bad, and I was going to leave my small Virginia hometown behind.
Yeah.
Um, Learned real quickly that that wasn't the case. I
Mhm.
ended up transferring, and we can talk about that too, because I'm a unique case. I have like done all of the things that the NCAA, I guess, rules are built around.
Yeah.
But yeah, I ended up transferring after my freshman year because I just didn't feel like it was the right fit for me overall.
Gotcha. And you mentioned the transfer process, so we'll hit that
Yeah.
just kind of talk about and from your experience, because again, I went to school as well, during a time when NIL, transfer portal, none of this stuff existed. So can you talk about kind of your experience in the transfer portal, you could say, or transferring in a way?
Yeah, so this was before the days of the portal. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna date myself a little bit here and say
Yeah.
that I was looking to transfer in 2008, so after my freshman year.
Mhm.
And essentially at that time, in order to go from a Division 1 to a Division 1, you had to sit a year. So you had to
Mhm.
take a year sitting. And for me, that was just like the death penalty. I couldn't imagine sitting because I had had such a miserable experience at Manhattan College. I didn't really play. When I did play, it wasn't well.
Yeah.
Um, I just was miserable. I was too far from home. I just wasn't in a good spot. I didn't feel supported by my coaches. I
Mhm.
just wanted out. And
Yeah.
so I went to athletics and essentially asked to be let out, and my coach denied it. So
Uh,
then I had to kind of fight her, um, and essentially say that I wasn't going to transfer to another school in the conference. And I ended up saying out loud, like, I don't even think I'm going to transfer to another Division 1 school. So, like, if you're worried about me as your competition, it's not going to happen.
yeah.
I ended up saying and going to transfer down to a Division 2. Um,
Mhm.
and I thought it was the greatest fit ever. I went to a small liberal arts college in Wingate, North Carolina, which is outside of Charlotte. It was the
Mhm.
perfect fit for me. It was small school, classroom sizes were tiny. Our
Yeah.
softball program was fantastic. We could have beat the absolute brakes off of my Manhattan College softball team. Like,
Yeah.
just because I went Division 2 doesn't mean that we weren't good.
Yeah.
Um, and I just had the greatest experience there. So for me, like transferring was a really stressful process during that like
Mhm.
6 month period.
Yeah.
Um, but it led to such a really good blessing for me coming out of it. Which is why I'm such a big advocate for the transfer portal now, because I'm like,
Yeah.
how awesome is it that student athletes don't have to seek coaches' permission?
Yeah. Well, and also seeking that right fit too, like you mentioned, like,
Yeah.
hey, well, if you want out, you can get out now, and you're not, like you said, like you're not going to have coaches or administrators kind of deny or try to force you to stay in that regard. And so, no, it's great that you found the fit at Wingate, and you found your home there, and it's and you mentioned not transferring in the conference or not transferring at other schools in conference. I know that was a big thing pre all this transfer portal, that where, because I know Cam Newton, I think, was a part of that, where from Auburn or Florida State, wherever he transferred to Auburn, they were kind of holding him to staying in the conference and things like that. So, or potentially not transferring in the same conference, all that stuff. So it's crazy to see how that process, like you mentioned, how that process has really changed in just what 16 years. I think you said 2008, correct? So
Yeah.
16 years, how much that process has really developed and changed. And so what I know you said you played softball in college at Wingate, but what really kind of drove your decision to kind of switch from softball to go more the academia side? Can you talk about that decision, or
Mhm.
from athletics in general to more of academia? Um,
Yeah, it was complete happenstance, to be
okay.
completely and truthfully honest.
Yeah.
I was a graduating senior in 2011. I
Mhm.
was a communications journalism major. I had interned at a couple different papers. I had written an intern at as a PR consultant with Wingate. Like I'd worked all these little odd end jobs. I was like ready to break my mold out in the communications world.
Yeah, yeah.
Was when, the newspaper industry died. And so I had no job coming out of undergrad that I thought I had.
Mhm.
And so my coach was like, why don't you just stay and be a GA? And I was like, I don't know. I don't really know what I want to do. And
Yeah.
like, why don't you just be a GA and get school paid for and you can figure it out?
Yeah.
My coach was one of my biggest advocates. She was working in the athletic department at the time. And so
Uh-huh.
um, I said, all right, sure. And so I stayed as a GA and I worked in a couple different positions in athletics. I was working in compliance, I was working in game day operations,
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of touched a lot of different places, and I didn't really like love any of them. I was like, these jobs aren't bad per se. I just don't feel like this is for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I had this really unique opportunity my second year. No, I'm sorry. After I had finished my program, I graduated a semester early from my master's program because I just kind of hustled through it.
Gotcha.
Um, and so I was still working at Wingate, but I had finished my program. And my professor from undergrad who taught in our graduate program, he was my advisor, got really sick, and they were saying, "Hey, would you happen to just like fill in on the first day? Can you just like go over his syllabus for him because
Uh-huh.
you took class with him?"
Yeah.
Like, okay, sure. So I go
Uh-huh.
on the first day, I teach my first class as a college professor, which by the way, I'm not even remotely qualified to teach at that time.
Yeah.
And I fell in love with it. And I was like, okay, this would be really cool. Like, what if I was just a professor? So I let
Yeah.
myself kind of dream that semester about what it would be like to be on the other side of higher ed, to be on the academic side.
Yeah. Yeah.
I ended up teaching that whole class because unfortunately his illness got worse.
Mhm.
And they couldn't find a replacement, so it was me. I was the
Gotcha.
replacement.
Gotcha.
Um, and it drove me to apply for my PhD. So obviously it obviously had a pretty profound impact because I decided to completely shift my career. I wanted to go into marketing before that moment.
Gotcha.
And after that, I was like, oh, I want to be a professor. I want to teach.
Yeah, no, and then it's crazy. I mean, I see a lot of parallels with kind of your story and kind of how I kind of ended up where I'm at and kind of the position I'm at, where again was a journalism major, like yourself, undergrad, and then thought, hey, I want to go do like I was working and interning in sport communications, working for the football team, like doing video and videography, and that was kind of passion. And then really just connected with individuals in academia at the time, and was then started my master's program. Was able to connect with Dr. Havard at Memphis, and really good mentor and giving me opportunities to realize, well, maybe a PhD is a great option for me. And so that's kind of how that happened. So I see a lot of parallels between kind of where you are and like your entry into academia and kind of mine as well. And so can you talk about your PhD experience? I know you went to Go Vols, by the way. You went to the University of Tennessee for your PhD. So can you talk about your doctoral experience, kind of what that was like?
Yeah, so again, I'm a unique case. I actually went to Middle Tennessee State for a year out of my master's program. So after I had spent that semester teaching and finished my job that I was working at Wingate, I was working in admissions.
Okay.
Um, and went to the program that my then advisor of our graduate program had gone to. He was like, "You should
Okay.
go to Middle Tennessee State. That's where I went to school." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, sure, I'll
Yeah.
go there."
Uh-huh.
Ended up not being a good fit. Just they weren't really emphasizing sport. They decided to kind of take their program in a different direction, more like rec and tourism based.
Gotcha.
And saw a call for Dr. Hardin, who's the advisor I served under,
Mhm.
and was looking for a doc student, and primarily one who was maybe interested in transition and athletic identity, but maybe even like women in sports spaces. And
Mhm.
so I sent him an email and wrote, I think, a kind of like a personal statement, and we interviewed, and I drove to Knoxville so that I could meet him and got into the program. And I
Gotcha.
was lucky at Tennessee that our program is small. Like our cohort is rather small in comparison to a lot of other doc programs in the country.
Gotcha.
So there were only 4 or 5 of us under him at a time.
Mhm.
And then maybe like 10 of us total in the entire sports studies like area.
Gotcha.
And I think that was really great because it meant that we really depended on each other and we taught and learned from each other as much as we taught and learned from our professors.
Mhm.
So I actually think a lot of times we maybe learn more lessons from working with each other as doc students and like how to lead or how to follow or how to write or how do we present together?
Yeah.
We learn these lessons kind of as a group.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I still publish with all of those women today, which is really
Yeah.
fantastic. Like those relationships are still very strong to this day.
For sure. For sure. And if and you graduate from Tennessee, and can you talk about your experience? I know you said you connect with a lot of different other individuals at the University of Tennessee. I know I've seen your work with Dr. Taylor as well, specifically as well, and kind of you, Dr. Hart and Dr. Taylor, and what you guys have done has been great work. And can you talk about the transition from your PhD into your first job all the way out in Albuquerque, New Mexico?
Yeah, I did a postdoc coming out of my undergrad or out of my undergrad. Wow, this is how I know we're talking at the end of the day because I'm like my words, right? I
Nice.
did a postdoc out of my doc program because I felt like I didn't quite have the research background that I needed,
Mhm.
compared to my peers, at least.
Gotcha.
And so did that for a year, interviewed during that year, got the job at UNM. I
Uh-huh.
was really excited to move to Albuquerque. I love the desert. I've always been kind of fascinated by the desert.
Yeah.
And so came into UNM pretty gung-ho and like excited to be on the ground at a new place.
Yeah.
And I think the program, I would like to believe that the program was better for my 3 years there.
Yeah.
I think maybe the students would definitely say that.
Mhm.
And I think it was a unique position there because so much of their program is built on doctoral students. They have a huge cohort. So in comparison to Tennessee, you have 10 students maybe, they've
Yeah.
got 30 to 40 students that
Oh,
they're doctoral students. So I got thrust into being an advisor year
immediate.
one. And I was just like, wait, I barely got out. Like, should I be advising anyone at this point?
Yeah.
But I also think there's no greater lesson than kind of being thrown in the fire.
Yeah.
And I think there's no greater lesson than saying to someone that you're advising, hey, maybe I had it this way and it was hard and it was intentionally difficult, but
Mhm.
like I don't want that for you. Like I want to try to like help you figure out the secret code. Like this isn't supposed to be a secret. This is
Yeah.
supposed to be like something that you know how to do and you're set up for success.
Gotcha.
I was really lucky. I had three students who, two while I was at UNM that graduated under me, and
Yeah.
then a third who graduated when I went to UMass Boston under me as my like actual students, which was kind of incredible to be, pretty young in tenure track and be, responsible for other people's PhD life.
Yeah. No, for sure. For sure. And I want to also touch on while we're talking about this, your research as well. Can you touch on that? You talked about being, I mean, tenure track or living the tenure track life, and and I
Yeah.
know in the doc program that I'm in at Northern Colorado, we talk about publish or perish and all that stuff with publications. Can you talk about your research interests and your research, kind of provide our viewers and listeners with that as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I think for me at least the publish or perish motto that we hear a lot in academia, I heard that a lot too. Um,
Yeah.
I think, I want to make space for that. Not everyone has to abide by that, and there are jobs and places where you're not going to have that be your life if you don't want it to be.
Yeah.
I've always been really intentional about being myself, and either you love or you hate it. There's no in between with me.
Yeah.
So either job wants me and thinks I'm incredible, or they're like, man, we can't stand this lady. Get her out of here.
Yeah.
That's okay with me. I don't have to be loved by everybody.
Mhm.
And so I just want to point that out because I just think it's important
Yeah.
for doc students and other young professionals to hear. Like, it's okay if you're not just cranking out 50 articles in a year. You don't
Yeah.
have to do that.
Yeah.
Please don't do that to yourself.
Yeah.
My research has kind of been it's ebbed and flowed a little bit, but it's kind of
Uh-huh.
mainly been in two distinct areas. So I've looked at kind of the organizational behavior of college sport. So primarily looking at how athletic departments and personnel look at providing experiences for student athletes related to athletic identity, related to transitioning out of the sport, and
Mhm.
ensuring that like they're fully functioning, you know, capable individuals that are going out into the world, into the workforce, and that they've been given the same resources as other students on their campuses.
Gotcha.
So that's like kind of like one sector. And then the other side looks at a lot of things related to what is our structure in sports spaces that has made it to where women have really had a lot of struggles moving into leadership positions over the course of history, especially um, when we think about Title IX, since Title IX has been ratified,
Yeah.
we've actually seen women have less leadership roles in women's sports than before. And we could have a whole discussion about why that is another day.
Yeah.
But essentially, my research is looking to try to expose that diversity in thought and diversity in what people look like at the top is actually a really great thing for sports spaces. And
Mhm.
so one of the ways that we can do that is by opening the doors to more women and more women of color.
Gotcha. And it's been great to see. I know I see like I said, I'd mentioned your work with Dr. Harden and Dr. Taylor and all the work that you've done. I've followed your work for a couple of years now as I've gone to started my PhD program and stuff like that. So it's been great to kind of see. And the best thing is, when and seeing your research have impact and all that great stuff, which you've done. And so it's been great to kind of see that process evolve. And so through that,
Thank you. That's pretty
appreciate it.
kind.
Yeah. So through that as well, I know you also work with, I know you've been starting to write for Awful Announcing. You've worked with the Women's Rugby League. Can you talk about your work? I know in academia, we talked about kind of your responsibilities teaching and your research, but I want to transition into talking about your work outside as well and the work that you do
Yeah.
outside as well.
Yeah, I would say that those two things are definitely more like individually based and
Gotcha.
spearheaded. I don't know that like any of my previous jobs would have been like, oh, we love that you're working two other part-time jobs with a full-time job, right?
Gotcha. Yeah.
But for me, as someone who I teach a lot of our sport communication content, I'm sure you probably will too, based on your communication background.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm like, I can't be a practitioner. I can't teach about the things related to sport communication if I don't do it still, if I don't have some
Yeah.
tie to the industry.
For sure.
So Awful Announcing was pretty intentional. I went to the women and men's Elite Eight, Sweet 16 last year and saw some pretty stark differences in the ways in which they were presented, the
Uh-huh.
fan interactions, just the vibes were very different going to those two distinct areas.
Gotcha.
So I wanted to write about it, and I just, if I can be a resource for anyone, I'm always like saying yes. And I feel like the people that I've connected with on Twitter are the same. And
Yeah.
so I said on Twitter, hey, I feel like I've got a story to tell. Does anyone
Mhm.
feel like anyone would pick up on it? And
Yeah.
luckily, Steve Ditmore, who I know, he's the head of athletic directors U. He's also a professor.
Yep.
He essentially said, I'm interested in what you got to say, Allison. Like, if you want to write us an article. That one I had to write a lot more like academically
Mhm.
because Athletic Directors U basically takes research articles and makes them like white papers.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in that same comment section, I had someone say, I'd love to introduce you to my awful announcing article or awful announcing editor if you would be open to it. And I said, yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So hit the ground running in April or
Mhm.
May, and
Mhm.
I've written since.
Gotcha.
Um, Women's Elite Rugby came about because a former professor at UMass Boston is the president of the league and a
Mhm.
good friend. And we had had a lot of different conversations about her wanting to start and grow this league. And she said, hey, would you come on and help us write from a PR standpoint? I
Yeah.
don't say no to many opportunities like that to help women's sports. So I said,
Yeah.
yeah. And so now I'm trying to manage all of them at once. I
Yeah.
will say there's a little bit of a dance there. Um,
Mhm.
but I've enjoyed it. I think that the industry stuff makes me feel really excited, and it also helps me connect a lot with our students in the classroom. Like I feel like I can talk about a lot of really current things with them.
Yeah.
I'm always having to read and digest so much for my other jobs.
Yeah. Well, and it's great to kind of see I'm in the same mind space as you in terms of, if I don't want to teach my students something if I haven't not I specifically haven't experienced it, but like I want to be involved in that process so that I can provide. I feel like you said, you provide more, you can connect better with your students. I feel the same way on my end as well. So it's great to see kind of how that connection works. And again, it's great to see. I mean, I've read most of your awful announcing articles.
Oh,
Follow
thanks.
you on the women's elite rugby side. So it's been great to see your work with that and what you've done with your combining your research and your outside work as well for women's sports and what you continue to do for that. So appreciate that. And so before we end the episode, I always ask my guests two questions. So I'll ask you the first one is, what's the best piece of advice that you've ever received? Whether it be in sport, whether it's in your PhD program, it could be, you could give me two. One is as an athlete, and one as
Yeah, hold
a
on.
doc student
I
or
think I
a,
have it as a quote on my phone, so I'm just gonna look at my phone
gotcha.
real fast. I'm
Gotcha.
not like being rude to our listeners here. I'm
Oh
just
no, you're good.
looking at my phone to make sure I have this written here.
Yeah.
Oh man. It actually came from Peloton.
Uh-huh.
Just so funny. I'm gonna try to paraphrase that, but it was like be unbelievably kind with yourself as you show up into the world because today you got out of bed, today you showed up like you're here.
Mhm.
You need to express and give yourself kindness for that moment in and of itself.
Gotcha.
Because I think sometimes in our field, like sport, the
Yeah.
only thing you're recognized for is achievement.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of times we beat ourselves up a lot for not being the perfect, the best, the
Mhm.
most published, the most whatever. And so I
Yeah.
think maybe my biggest piece of advice to young professors or people wanting to work in sport in general is just like be proud of yourself for showing up, be proud of yourself for the work you do, whether you get recognized for it or not. And like be okay with who you are first and
Mhm.
don't be dependent on that achievement recognition to be okay with who you are. Because
Yeah.
I think I've had to learn that lesson hard as an adult.
Yeah. No, that's, that's a great point there, right? It's like, we're all achievement focused. And then if you don't achieve, then it's like, oh, well, I failed. Like, I'm not good enough.
Yeah, 0 or 100. There's no middle ground.
So it's great to hear that from you is, if you're there, you're showing up, you're doing the right things, you're great regardless. And you don't have to be so achievement focused. And that's it's great to kind of hear that advice. But it's all the time we have for this episode of the Athlete Insights podcast. Again, I want to thank Dr. Allison Smith for joining me today, and I'll have your social media accounts linked on the video in the YouTube description, on Spotify in that description as well. So you guys can follow Dr. Smith and her journey at Georgia State and beyond, and follow her work as well, her research, and her outside work as well. I'll have my podcast. You can find it on YouTube, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, pretty much everywhere you get a podcast, you can find this one. So, Dr. Smith, I appreciate you. I know it's it's in the evening time. It's been a long day. I appreciate you taking the time and spending it with me. But we'll
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
yeah, we'll see you next time.